Well, go on, everybody. Lennox here from Simple 123 Trader. This is the playbook weekly outlook for February 28th to March 5th. Hope everybody's doing well and are safe. Okay, we're going to take a look at what expected for this week in the futures, and this will help you in making decisions for plays in the major U.S. pairs and the Forex. And I'll also look at the indices for the stock market as well and give you an idea of what might be shaping up there. So looking at last week's bar, the expected trajectory was for a move to the downside because of where we were in our overall structure on the chart. And we had reached a very high point and was looking for a pullback. And indeed, we've gotten that. Now, what is to be expected for this week coming up? Based on what's setting up here, I can basically draw out what I think is going to occur for this week. And this is the Australian dollar. It had quite a run, but it looks like it has finished its move to the upside. And now I would expect this week a further move back up to challenge the previous highs, but I don't think it's going to even get near there. And we will probably more than likely turn back and start heading down. Okay, so for the upcoming week, I would expect a move to the upside, but I think it'll be short-lived, and we'll see further weakness in the Australian dollar going into later on in the week. Okay, so on the daily time frame, you can see right now that we are indeed in a downward trajectory, and we might expect a slight bounce back up. But again, I think that might be short-lived, and we'll be heading back to the downside in short order. Okay, so be aware of that. And of course, the Aussie, the Euro, GBP, New Zealand are all dependent on the US dollar. So whatever the US dollar is going to be doing, these pairs will be doing the opposite. And the USD CAD, USD Swiss, USD Japanese yen, even Bitcoin and gold might be doing what the US dollar is doing in tandem. Okay, so let's go through them and we'll see how they're all setting up. So that's the Australian dollar. Let's take a look at Bitcoin. So Bitcoin also, again, hit a peak. I expected price to get near to 60,000. It had a high of 57,790, so pretty close, and then we had a pullback. Now, what's to be expected this week? Again, similar to the Australian dollar, expect a movement back up in the short term, but again, that might be short-lived as well. So right now we're in an overall down mode, and again we could see a little further movement down before we get a push back to the upside. But I don't see this breaking the previous highs, at least not this week. So attempts may be at it, but it's going to be a battle for Bitcoin going back up. All right, crude oil. Crude oil on the weekly is now hitting previous resistance, and a very strong previous resistance on the weekly. Are we going to just slice through like butter and continue to the upside? That's totally possible. The other possibility, of course, is that we could see a downturn in crude oil. This is also going to depend, of course, on the weather and its conditions across the United States and so forth. But right now, looking like we've hit resistance, and we should see a little pullback, at least in the short term, for crude oil. Okay, of course, it can turn around and continue straight through, but in the short term, like I say, a short pullback before any further moves to the upside. Looking at the Canadian dollar. The Canadian dollar also has been very strong recently, but it also reached a peak and has turned to the downside. So if I go to the monthly, we'll see that where that peak actually reached, and it reached into previous resistance. And so that was expected that we would get into that area. And it is an area we could have gone as high as there or even higher, but it's turned back now, and I would expect further movements to the downside for the Canadian dollar, again, at least in the short term, and then an attempt back up at the highs, but without breaking those previous highs. So I'm expecting price to come up, maybe a back up to this area before it turns back to the downside. So a little bit of weakness in the short term, then some upside for the remainder of the week, and then further weakness as the end of the week progresses for the Canadian dollar. Let's take a look at the US dollar. Now, the US dollar has seen lots of weakness, and I expect that to continue as well because we're not out of the woods with the US dollar. I can see right now on the chart that yes, it's pushing to the upside, but I see further weakness in play going forward. So right now, in the short term, it's pushing to the upside, but I think that's going to be short-lived. I don't think we'll be breaking these highs, and we will see price um, turning back to the downside in short order here. Okay, so that will bode well for um, Aussie and Euro and GBP and New Zealand to go to the upside once the US dollar continues its move to the downside. So further to that, it's again just a little bit of a up move tonight, perhaps, and then that might be the end of that for the remainder of the week, perhaps. Okay, let's take a look at the euro. Euro on the weekly. It's also reached a peak, but it is in a different mode here. What I'm seeing here is further upside for the euro, and that's also going to depend, like I say, highly on what the US dollar does. The US dollar is doing the opposite and will be moving up and then down. So I see the euro continuing to the upside against the US dollar. And so for the short term, maybe a little bit of a down because the US dollar is moving up. But in the long term, right from the remainder of the week, we should see further pushes to the upside for the euro. Okay, next is the Swiss franc. So the Swiss franc on the weekly has also reached a peak and is turned back to the downside, looking very weak right now. And I would see this continuing to the downside for at least a few more days. I don't see this challenging this area anymore. We might come back a little bit, but it's going to be continued weakness for the Swiss franc going forward into the week. Okay, let's take a look at gold. Gold on the weekly. Gold has also been in a funk, and the US dollar along with it. So the further the US dollar falls, I see gold also continuing its weakness. I've not seen a turnaround for gold at this point. So still further weakness going into this week. Of course, that could easily change with any kind of bad news coming out. We're inside of a channel right now. We're at the lower end of the channel, so we could see a bounce back up, but it'll be short-lived if at all. I don't think it'll be breaking, these highs. So if we do get a bounce, it'll be short-lived, and this will continue to the downside as the week progresses. Okay, let's take a look at the Japanese yen. The Japanese yen has been in quite some weakness, and it is continuing to be weak. And again, I don't see any turnaround for the Japanese yen at this point. It's still very weak. So continued weakness in Japanese yen going into this week. The New Zealand dollar on the weekly has also reached a peak. And again, if I go to the monthly, we'll see why we've reached a peak. It's because we were at a very serious resistance area. We've hit it, and we're now turning to the downside. So looking on the weekly, we are turning to the downside. On the daily, we are still going down. So we might get a little bit of a pushback, but more likely down, at least in the short term. And as the US dollar firms or weakens, sorry, as the US dollar weakens, we'll see this firm back up and push back up. But I don't think it'll be breaking the highs that was previously established. Okay, so let's take a look at the Mexican peso. And on the weekly, the peso is showing some weakness right now. On the daily, we're pushing to the downside, trying to turn around at this point. It is possible for it to push back up a little bit, but again, further weakness for the Mexican peso as the US dollar weakens. If the US dollar weakens dramatically, the peso is likely to bounce up against it, but right now it's in a weak state. So we'll see how that one plays out. Okay, we'll take a look at the British pound. The British pound has been very strong. Last week it was very strong, hit a peak as well. And the reason for that peak is because we hit previous resistance, just like the other pairs. And so we're turning back to the downside now. And so expected move is a little bit of down. However, any continued weakness of the US dollar will push the GBP back up. However, it will be short-lived because I don't believe it's going to break the highs and we'll be continuing back down in short order. So what that's telling us is that the US dollar, although weak, might come to an end of its weakness in pretty soon, maybe before this week's out, and we could see some turning around of that of the US dollar currency. Okay, silver. Silver on the weekly is in a very choppy area. It's hit previous resistance. It couldn't break through, and now it's in a chopped up area and very volatile right now. It looks like we have further weakness in silver as we go into this week. So a little bit of a pullback in silver for the week, and we'll see how that one plays out as well. So for the U.S. Small cap Russell 2000 on the weekly, it's trying to push back to break the previous highs, and I think that it will do that no problem this week. I think it's going to push through and break the previous highs, and we'll be into new territory for the Russell 2000 going into this week. For the US 30, the Dow Jones Industrial on the weekly, it also pushed to new highs, record highs this week, and again is looking to push back one more time. And I think that it might also do that as well. So I'm kind of seeing a pattern here. This is going to be a tough one for it to break that previous high, but I think it'll try very hard to do that going into this week. The US 500, the S&P 500, also made new highs, a week ago, and now is again pulled back a little bit, and is now trying to attempt to break the previous highs. It too will also have a struggle trying to get up there, but I think it will make it to those highs, maybe even break the new highs as well. The U.S. Technology Group had quite a pullback this week, as you can see, and now it's attempting to continue its move to the upside. I think that too will also push to the highs, and we might see a breakthrough to new highs this week in the U.S. technology sector. So looking at the daily, it is trying very hard, and it's got a long climb. As you can see, it took a number of days for it to come from the high to the low. So it's going to take a number of days for this to get back up to that level as well. All right, so that's a look at what's setting up for this week in the futures and indices. So profitable trading to everyone. Be safe. We're done now. Thank you.